Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Kirwan Bi-Weekly Forum. We're excited to host this important conversation today on housing and race, and we're happy to have you, that you've taken time out of your day to join us. We meet here every Thursday from 11 a.m. to 12:15 p.m., although some of our speakers stay afterwards if they can. Out of caution during the pandemic, we've moved our forum to this online webinar format in order to promote public safety and make our forums more accessible. Just a few notes about this new format that we feel you should be aware of before we get started. Everyone except the forum presenters and Kirwan staff are muted in terms of audio and video, so don't worry about having to mute yourself or deal with any video settings. No one will be able to hear or see anyone except our presenters. Also, the chat feature is disabled for this webinar, but we encourage you to make use of the Q&A button to ask questions or raise concerns about the webinar. Someone from the Kirwan team will be monitoring Q&A and will help with any problems with the webinar, and will collect questions to ask presenters when it comes time for Q&A towards the end of the program. Finally, the webinar is being recorded so we can make that available through our social media afterwards and to registered applicants through email. Though no one is except the presenters will be recorded, we want to make sure everyone is aware of that ahead of the time, just for the sake of transparency. Today, we're pleased to be joined by Glennon Sweeney and Michael Outrich from right here at the Kirwan Institute. Glennon is a senior research associate at the Kirwan Institute. Her work centers on the formation of metropolitan space and its evolution, and the role of suburban municipalities in creating metropolitan-wide equity. Specifically, her research focuses on jurisdictional authority, fragmentation and competition at the metropolitan scale, suburban development motivations, desegregation efforts, and the role of economic development in addressing spatial inequality at the neighborhood scale. And applied as social scientists engaging in interdisciplinary transformative scholarship, all of Glennon's research is designed to generate real-world impacts, the co-production of knowledge, and dissemination in both community and scholarly contexts. Glennon holds a bachelor's degree in geography and political science, a master's degree in the City and Regional Planning, and is currently a PhD candidate in the City and Regional Planning Department. Michael Outrich is a social researcher and GIS specialist at the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity. His research focuses on opportunity mapping, housing insecurity, housing market dynamics, affordable housing challenges, economic and racial inequality and disparity, and youth homelessness and other child welfare issues. Michael specializes in geospatial analysis and mapping techniques, where he uses the skills combined with data analytics and advocacy to influence changes in the policy at the local, state, and federal levels. Michael has a bachelor's degree in geographic information sciences and a master's degree in city and regional planning. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Michael and Glennon to get us started.
Thank you, Kip. Go ahead and share my screen, and thanks for joining us today, everybody. Going to go ahead and get started. See if I can get this to go. So at the Kirwan Institute, we kind of made our name through our spatial analysis work. And one of the things that we noticed as we started doing this work is that we see spatial inequality from birth to death. And so this is an infant mortality map. And if you can see my pointer here, which I hope you can see that the hot spots for inequality run kind of south of I-70 and east of I-71. There's kind of this upside down T shape you see there. And then this map here is opportunity. The lighter shades are lower opportunity. You see similar shape, that upside down T. This is poverty. Darker spots are higher poverty. Again, we see that same upside down T shape in Central Ohio. And again, with incarceration, this is African-American incarceration rates. And then senior vulnerability and density. So the red and the orange are the places you want to look for on this. And here we can see Bexley really pops out with the colors used in this map as an outlier. But we can also see that overwhelmingly, we still have that shape here. And then we can see it again with life expectancy. And so the brighter colors are lower life expectancy rates. And in Central Ohio, the difference in life expectancy from this track up here in Dublin and this track down here in Franklinton is 26.7 years. And so where you live really matters, and where you're born really matters, right? So we spent a lot of time wondering what explains this. And one of the things that my work focuses on is, how does history play a role? And so we're going to kind of walk you through a little bit of the history today, and then we're going to kind of go into some current conditions and give some examples from a study we did with the Franklin County Auditor. about current conditions. And we're going to focus on Central Ohio today, although the vast majority of this story is applicable to pretty much any major metropolitan area in the United States, except for a couple portions, which we'll point out. And then the current conditions with the auditor's report is absolutely focused on Central Ohio, although I suspect that there are similar issues in most regions, given how appraisals are done. And Michael will get into that. So we're going to start really with understanding suburbia, because prior to the 1890s, suburbia wasn't really what we envision in our minds today, right? When I say the word suburb, a lot of you guys probably think about white picket fences. You might think about cookie cutter houses, maybe a lot of green space, big yards, right? And a lot of people even say, rich white people when you think about suburbs. And I always ask, usually when I give these presentations, it's difficult though over Zoom. But that wasn't true before 1890. Before 1890, pretty much everything outside of the central city was considered suburban. And these were the true opportunity lands in the United States. This is where low-income families, immigrants, people of color could go and buy land for cheaply. This was unregulated, unplanned, and unrestricted land. And so often people would build their own homes and they would use those homes. And you got to keep in mind, a lot of this time, this is prior to 18, and a lot of these homes, particularly as you get into the 20th century with the Great Migration, folks were using these homes. They would build an extra room on the back so that they could take in boarders. A lot of people would have a small farm and maybe raise some hogs to sell. So they would use their homes also to generate supplemental income. A lot of these neighborhoods did not have sewer systems. And often, if they did become annexed by a major city, they would resist that type of infrastructure for fear of being priced out of their neighborhood. All right. And a good local example of that is American Addition, which is a community in South Linden. It's just east of Joyce Avenue. And so this community was one of these kind of unplanned and peripheral suburbs. A lot of the homes were originally built by people themselves. And by 1925, given the Great Migration impact on Central Ohio, the community was over 90% Black. But it remained kind of rustic. It was unpaved streets, no water or sewer services. It was eventually annexed by the city of Columbus in 1959. Sewer system was installed a decade later. But infrastructure upgrades still continue to this day. One thing I want to point out, though, is that in the heat of the housing crisis, we see a very high owner occupancy rate in a predominantly African-American neighborhood. In part, I believe, is the legacy of the age of this neighborhood. And a lot of these families, my assumption is, probably have owned land in that neighborhood for a while. But we also want to keep in mind that Linden was the neighborhood in Central Ohio hit hardest by the subprime crisis. And so the fact that so many of these homes remained occupied by owners by 2010 is actually quite surprising for that neighborhood and kind of points to that history of the neighborhood. But by the 1890s, though, we also started to see the planned suburb come into play. And this is really what solidifies in our minds the imaginary of what suburbs are when we think about those white picket fences. And so these were different suburbs. They were different than developments that had happened before them. And the main difference with these is how they were financed. The people who built these early suburbs were able to get investors actually to build enough capital that they could build slowly. They could buy a large chunk of land and they could be really picky about who they sold those lots to allow build on those lands so that they could create a community of the kind of people that they wanted to live with, essentially. And they framed these communities as escapes to restricted and healthy and clean and safe environments. Because you got to remember, in the 1890s, cities were pretty dirty. All right. Not every city even had sewer systems installed. A lot of cities were relying on rivers for sewers. And so riverfronts were often very disgusting, quite frankly. Cities were overcrowded. We didn't have a lot of regulation. There was danger and there was disease that was really brought by the conditions, right? We had a lot of poverty and a lot of people living in close quarters. But the people who were building these suburbs did not seem to connect that it was the conditions that the structural conditions that created the dirtiness really that they referred to in the city. They thought it was the people. They thought it was immigrants. They thought it was people of color. And they really targeted these groups as undesirable people. And they wanted to build suburbs and build neighborhoods where they could live with just people like them. And so there was actually a group, and in fact, King Thompson, the developer of Upper Arlington, the father of Upper Arlington really, was a member of this group called Developers of High Class Residential Properties. And these guys created best practices for suburban plan developments. And they distributed these all over the country and tried to get other people to follow suit and build developments like these. And they advertised these as restricted. All right, and so we're going to talk about what we mean by restriction here. And so at this time, like I said, there was kind of a hierarchy that these people kind of assumed was reality as to who was better than others, I guess would be one way of saying it. And white Protestants were very much at the top of this. And, you know, lower income whites were below. And then there were groups specifically targeted with what we call which we call restrictive covenants in home deeds. And this is how they controlled who lived in these communities. And they most frequently targeted people of color. And so you can see from this racial restriction here, it's, you know, it restricts anyone who is not a person of the white or Caucasian race. There were also restrictions that targeted specific groups. They would target African Americans, Native Americans, Hispanics, and Asians in particular, and they use language I will not say in those deeds, which is why I also use this example, because it's not as horrible in the words used. But they also restricted religious groups as well. And so at that time, if we think about, you know, in the early 20th century in the United States, Jews and Catholics were the two groups targeted. And so those groups were often restricted in these. Now, this is just what you see on this screen is all racial restrictions in Central Ohio. So there's this great book by Patricia Burgess. Well, it's great to me. You guys might think it's boring. I'm a nerd though. It's called Planning for the Private Interest, Land Use Controls and Residential Patterns in Columbus, Ohio, 1900 and 1970. And she does a really good job of kind of really looking into what kinds of restrictions were used, because restrictive covenants not only specifically targeted people for identity, they also really, most restrictive covenants were actually targeted at class. And they were things like minimum square footage requirements. You had to build a home that was of a certain size. You had to spend a certain amount of money to build that home. That way you wouldn't skimp on material and things like that, certain lot sizes, so that it would restrict people who couldn't afford that. And so these were used prolifically in Central Ohio. As we can see, Columbus really used them. Columbus or Franklin County used them prolifically. And among the suburbs, we'd say Upper Arlington is probably the community that used them the most. And we can see they really picked up in the 1920s. And that's really when we started to see the impacts of the Great Migration in Central Ohio as well, which makes sense that people were nervous about living around African Americans. They would start inserting more clauses like this. But there's also a legacy of the religious restrictions in these. And we can think about Bexley when we think about that, right? So Bexley is known as kind of the hub of the Jewish community in Central Ohio. And that's because Bexley was the first community where Jews were able to break religious restrictions and move into the community. In fact, there is a quote in a book, what's it called? How the Suburbs Were Segregated by Paige Glotzer. A quote from King Thompson where he talks about how he benefited from Jewish infiltration on the east. He's speaking about Bexley there because people moved to Upper Arlington to avoid that from there. So there's a long history of this, but Catholic restrictions remained in Bexley actually for a while after those Jewish restrictions were broken. And so to this day, there's not one Catholic church inside of Bexley. There is a school, but that school was owned by the Catholic diocese prior to Bexley even being founded and being annexed into Bexley. And so there are a couple Catholic churches literally across the street from the Bexley city line, which just kind of points to the legacy of these restrictions. And you can still see the impact to this day, right? And these restrictions were actually very quickly codified into law with zoning codes. And probably the most well-known would be racial zoning. And so the city of Baltimore was one of the first cities to institute a racial zoning ordinance. And now the Barry Mahul was the mayor of Baltimore when this was passed. And Mahul was a progressive, all right? He was a liberal at the time, but he is quoted as saying, Blacks should be quarantined in the isolated slums in order to reduce the incidence of civil disturbance, to prevent the spread of communicable disease into the nearby white neighborhoods, and to protect property values among the white majority. Now, racial zoning was only in effect for 7 years. It was struck down by the United States Supreme Court in a case called Buchanan v. Worley. But those 7 years of development in the earliest 20th century really solidified some residential development patterns in a lot of our major cities and was very impactful in a lot of cities. But after racial zoning, right, after the Buchanan cities really developed techniques to continue to enforce segregation. And in the South, a lot of cities hired professional planners to create zoning codes that were racial, but not technically racial, to get around this law. And a lot of cities employ exclusionary zoning to this day, actually. And so this is zoning, which you see in a lot of suburbs, right, where they have minimum lot requirements that, you know, all lots are a quarter acre or half acre. I think Beaver Creek might be a very good example of that in the Dayton area. It's a Dayton suburb with larger lots and exclusionary zoning, or single family zoning, right? Upper Arlington, before they started their planned mixed use development, their PMUD, they have 7 of those around the city. Before they instituted that, and I think around 2015 or so, they were over 90% single family residential zoned, all right, which is very exclusionary. A lot of other suburbs are similar. Worthington is predominantly single family residential. Many of these communities are. And then a lot of cities also practiced expulsive zoning. Some still do to this day. And this is really the encouragement of detrimental land use. It's directed towards communities deemed undesirable. And so another good example of that is actually, I think it was Baltimore, it might be Boston. I'm getting my B cities confused. But when they implemented their citywide zoning code, and so also I want to point out these planned suburbs, there were Black planned suburbs as well. There were wealthy Blacks at this time building their own suburbs. And a lot of them used a lot of the same class-based restrictions in their property deeds. They just didn't use the people-based ones, the ones that targeted individuals for their identity, right? But a lot of them were built within city limits as well. A lot of these early suburban developments were actually built within city limits or just outside and then were annexed into cities at first, all right? And so I think it was Baltimore, but when they were built in Baltimore, when the city instituted their citywide zoning ordinance, one of the things they did is they targeted the area of town where all of the African Americans lived, including these wealthy suburbs, and they just zoned the whole thing industrial. And that invites in very undesirable land uses, and it's really a disinvestment policy in that community because it just makes property values plummet if a plant can be built next door, right? And it harms air quality, it harms all kinds of things, right? And this practice is actually pretty common to this day. If you look around your town, where is the dump located and who lives near it? And how was that decision made, right, as to where it would be located and who lived there when that decision was made? That's often a good way to see. And also wherever major industry is, the history behind that you can see. Historic designation has also been used as a tool to identify areas for redevelopment and push undesirables out. And so those are different ways that we continue to segregate through zoning and land use. And another way is utility access. So in Central Ohio, for example, the city of Columbus has a monopoly on sewer services and pretty much water. Westerville also does their own water, but all the other suburbs contract with the city of Columbus. And central cities often do this because it's not very practical for a small suburb, you know, like Worthington with 14,000 people to do, you know, to have a water treatment facility and to run the sewer system. So they will contract with the central city. And in Central Ohio, we only have one remaining Black suburb left. And we'll talk about why that is in a little bit. But that is Urban Crest. It's a village. And it was incorporated in 1948. It was actually founded in the 1890s. And Urban Crest's development was stalled for years because they had trouble accessing a water and sewer agreement with the city of Columbus. It's something I'm still looking into, but from what I found, I don't know why the city would not offer it to this particular suburb. I think they wanted it annexed. And a lot of times the city would refuse to offer if they didn't annex, but cities like Worthington were able to get one. Cities like Grandview Heights, like Upper Arlington. So it makes you wonder if, you know, the race of the people living in Urban Crest might have had something to do with the failure to get that service that to this day, Urban Crest is still underdeveloped as a result of not having that access for so many years. And so I want to keep going with policies here. So we're going to get into the 1930s and move into New Deal policy. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Homeowners Loan Corporation Act of 1933. And this is the act that created the policy that we know of as redlining today, all right? And so in the wake of the Depression, all right, one thing you have to understand, before the Depression, who owned homes was it was really only wealthy people. People of means were the ones who owned homes because securing a mortgage was very different, all right? You had to put a 50% down payment. And then you had a like 5 to 7 year mortgage during which you are only paying on the interest. You're not paying on the principal, all right? You're only paying on the interest during this time, all right? And then at the end, that other 50% is due. A lot of people just ended up getting other mortgages and rolling it over and trying to, or they lost their homes. But it was really only for the elite because low-income people couldn't manage to make this work. And when the Depression hit, some of the same people that owned homes and had mortgages also had stocks. They stopped paying their mortgages when the stock market crashed. And banks ended up going under as the result, all right? So the federal government is looking around. They're like, well, we need to create federal mortgage insurance. We can't let banks go under like this if we have another crash like this. We also need to create a new mortgage because we are going to promote homeownership. We want Americans to own homes, all right? But if we're going to get into this business and if we're going to federally insure mortgages, we need a way to identify which neighborhoods are too risky. All right, because what this map was actually designed to do is identify what neighborhoods where people were behind on those old mortgages that we're moving away from should be eligible for the new mortgages that we're moving into, all right? Very narrow what these maps were made for, actually, all right? They're called residential security maps, all right? All right, yeah, I don't know why I have it in this order, but we'll go here. And so the next year, the Federal Housing Administration was created in 1934, all right? And this entity continued the practice of redlining. They did it on their own, essentially. They did it slightly differently, all right? And the maps we have are from Holk, but the practice continued to inform who could receive mortgages and who could not. And in fact, in their underwriting manual, you see here, the Federal Housing Administration promotes segregation. If a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that properties shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. A change in social or racial occupancy generally leads to instability and a reduction in values. Now, they wrote this for years, they would promote this. And in fact, given the housing crisis that African Americans were experiencing, African Americans paid more for housing than whites. And FHA's own studies showed that this actually wasn't the truth. That a lot of times Blacks moving into a neighborhood would not reduce home values. Even if blockbusting occurred, which we'll get into later, did not reduce home values as much because of the inflated prices Blacks were paying for these homes. All right. And so redlining continued. All right. And so we'll talk a little bit about what these grades mean. And so this is Central Ohio. We've got Upper Arlington over here, Grandview Heights and Marble Cliff over here. We've got the Franklinton, the Hilltop. This is Westgate here. The South Side, German Village. This is Bexley over here. Coming up, we've got, let's see here, the Near East Side, in King Lincoln, coming up through Linden, and then we got Clintonville and then Worthington up here. A-grade communities were your wealthy and white communities, all right? This was parts of Clintonville, it was Upper Arlington, and they were restricted communities also, places that had racial restrictions, all right? Westgate out in the west side, which still is an enclave of wealth in the hilltop. Bexley, all right? And these places were eligible for up to 80% of the value of their home and a federally insured mortgage, all right? And so this is the history of where we get that 20% down payment. The mortgage that we know of today is these A-grade neighborhoods. B-grade communities were white middle class, maybe a few detrimental uses. They were eligible for up to 65% of the value of their home in a federally insured mortgage, 35% down payment. Doable, difficult, but doable for a lot of people. C-grade communities were working class, immigrant, and ethnic hubs, often near industry, and maybe experiencing neighborhood change. That is, there may be African Americans moving into the community or other groups deemed undesirable at the time. These communities were eligible for up to 15% of the value of their home in a federally insured mortgage. Take a minute and think about whether or not you think you could afford an 85% down payment right now, because that's what these neighborhoods required. And I don't know about you, but most people I know could not afford an 85% down payment. And so this policy effectively redlined a lot of these C-grade communities. I forgot to show you. So B-grade communities, Worthington, all the places around the A-grade communities you see are B-grade. And then C-grade communities, a lot out in the Linden area, some areas closer to downtown, areas kind of surrounding B areas, in fact, also a lot of the south side as well. And then your D-grade neighborhoods were Black and other minoritized populations, regardless of class. For example, King Lincoln, right? Which was an African American. It was our Bronzeville. It was our African American hub. It was a mixed race and mixed income community. There were wealthy African American doctors, lawyers, business owners living in very big houses in that community. But the community was graded D. Also detrimental land uses in those areas. So, like for example, in the city of Tacoma, there's this Green Line neighborhood with like this big red square in the middle, and it's because there's like this big transformer there, and so they made that red, and the rest around it is green. But these neighborhoods were ineligible for any federal mortgage insurance, zero. So you had to pay cash or you had to get a private loan, and most people aren't going to give you a loan, or they're going to give you a loan with extremely high interest rates if you're not federally insured. All right, and so this policy in those C and D grade neighborhoods was a disinvestment policy. But in those B and A grade neighborhoods, it was an investment policy, all right? It funneled resources to those neighborhoods and people to those neighborhoods. And it sucked resources out of these C and D grade neighborhoods. And we can see that these policies worked in tandem, all right? For example, wealthy African-American living in King Lincoln who doesn't want to lose all their wealth, right? They would move, right? But where can they go? These are all the places they couldn't go because of the prolific use of racial restrictions in Central Ohio. And so you can see how difficult it began to become for African Americans and really minoritized communities in general to own property. And I just want to point out that in the 20th century in the United States of America, property ownership is the primary mechanism by which Americans built wealth. All right. And we're shutting out entire groups of people from that. And then there were contract sales, all right, because a lot of African Americans were disenfranchised by the FHA. They weren't able to access these federally insured mortgages. They turned to contract sales, and contract sales had large down payments, high rates of interest, and ownership only transferred after the final payment in full compliance. All right, so there's no equity built during this 20 to 40 years of payment. All right, and tenants were often evicted for very minor infractions because it was a scam for a lot of landlords. All right, we can collect that rent, and if they do something little like, oh, that, you know, there's something in the yard or whatever, that, you know, something, they can just evict you for that. And so it made a very, so, you know, and it also was a disincentive. It disincentivized African Americans from investing in those homes until they fully owned them, because they knew that the chance of owning that home at the end was relatively low. And so are you going to fix things as they break down if you don't even know if you're going to be able to stay. And so we see the deterioration of a lot of these neighborhoods. But restrictions really continue and then evolve, all right? They remained legal through 1948. In 1948, there was a Supreme Court case, Shelley v. Kramer, and it made racial restrictions illegal. But it was a very narrow decision. It was so narrow, in fact, that a white person could sue an African-American who moved in next door to them, claiming loss of property value because the decision was so narrow. And so it really wasn't until the passage of the 1968 Fair Housing Act, or the Civil Rights Act of 1968, that we actually saw that restrictions really were gone for good, and that it was safer for African Americans they were protected moving into predominantly white communities. But I also want to point out that, harassment and local police often turned a blind eye, and homeownership associations played a role. And we'll talk a little bit about that later as well. And then we had highway development, right? As we get into the 50s. And the way I look at highway development, I don't know about you guys, but I went to Worthington schools when I was a kid. And, I remember in my AP US history class, Mr. Jordan talking about highway development. And, Eisenhower took that trip across the country and got stuck in the mud. And, we need highways for national defense was the big thing. And I believed that until I started investigating the issue a little bit more. And if we wanted to connect cities with highways, why would we drive highways through communities and destroy them, right? Because highways also facilitated white middle-class suburbanization, and they did so at the expense of communities of color. And part of that is because these communities, where we can see these highways overwhelmingly go through C and D grade communities, one reason for that is because these places were cheaper. It was cheaper to buy land with eminent domain in an area that you've already disinvested in, right? But I want to point out, I-70 here was supposed to go from here all the way up like that, through Bexley. But it didn't. It didn't because the people in Bexley essentially threw a fit and said, no way. And Bexley's got power, right? The governor lives in Bexley. Bexley's a powerful community. It's old wealth in Central Ohio. So they lobbied, and the highway instead kind of turned. And by the way, turning a highway is like so expensive. It's like millions of dollars, billions maybe even now. I don't even know how much it costs, but it's really expensive to turn a highway. So much cheaper to build highways straight. All right. But they turned it to go south of Bexley, and that little neighborhood there that got destroyed is a neighborhood called Hanford Village. And I think we'll talk about that later in this slide. I might have taken it out though. And if I did, I'll bring it up later. And so that was highways, right? And around the same time that we had highways, we had school desegregation happen, right? In the 1954 Brown ruling. And this is where the practice of blockbusting really took off, all right? And so blockbusting was a pretty nefarious practice by real estate brokers, where they would essentially exploit fear of racial integration, white fear of racial integration, and the severe housing shortage that African Americans were experiencing. And so I'll read this to you. This is an article by, really it was told by someone who practiced blockbusting. Finally, the last of the whites left, whether or not they could afford to move, like hundreds of others who have been similarly blitzed. They never knew what hit them. I knew. I triggered the whole sequence of events by buying the bungalow and quickly selling it to a Negro. I am a blockbuster. Another and perhaps slightly less odious name for my craft is real estate speculator. I specialize in locating blocks which I consider to be ripe for racial change. Then I bust them by buying properties from white owners and selling them to Negroes, with the intent of breaking down the rest of the block for colored occupancy. I make my money, quite a lot of it, incidentally, in three ways. One, by beating down the prices I pay the white owners, by stimulating their fear of what is to come. Two, by selling to the eager Negroes at inflated prices. And three, by financing these purchases at what amounts to a very high rate of interest. And so that is the practice of blockbusting. And so, as I said, racial covenants became illegal. And when that happened, home ownership associations really took off. All right. And in fact, in Upper Arlington, a homeownership association was actually found guilty of doing this. All right. So what homeownership associations did to maintain segregation after they could not use racial restrictions, they tended to do one of two things. First, they would say, fine, Blacks can live in this neighborhood, but anyone who lives in this neighborhood is required to be a member of the homeownership association. We are restricting membership to whites only. Now, the other thing they did, and I believe this is what the Upper Arlington community was found guilty of, is they would incent a right of first refusal clause into deeds to enable the homeownership association to purchase homes if they might be sold to non-whites. And so this would prevent that sale from happening. They would buy it and then they would find a buyer they approved of and sell it to them. All right. And then with Brown v. Board in 1954, we have separate but unequal is inherently separate but equal is inherently unequal. So schools were forced to desegregate, and there was major resistance, right? In fact, they had to have a second ruling in 55, which remanded, which really said desegregate with all deliberate speed. And the major resistance happened in the South, right? And we saw busing was the sorry, I thought I heard something. Busing was the preferred, was really the remedy that the courts implemented for most of these, and white flight ensued. But most cities got around Brown, right? And most cities got around Brown with this Milliken v. Bradley 1974 court case ruling. And so basically what this did is this was brought on by Detroit Public Schools, all right, because they were unable to desegregate via busing or any other means because the district was more than 2/3 Black. All right. And so the district created a busing plan to desegregate at the metropolitan level, which included 53 school districts. The court said no to this. They said that the segregation within Detroit was by choice and rejected the metropolitan desegregation plan. And this is how most cities got around Brown. All right, we can see, but that is not how Columbus got around Brown. And so Columbus is a capital city. And so one thing I want to just, before we get into how Columbus got around Brown, we need a quick, very short lesson on kind of Columbus governance and history. All right, Columbus was a capital city that was chosen to be the capital. All right, in fact, there were 3 capitals before Columbus: Chillicothe, Zanesville, and Chillicothe. And Columbus was chosen for its central location. They almost Dublin. Worthington was a contender. Franklinton was vying for it, but nobody wanted to be on a floodplain, so they went across the river. And in true Ohio fashion, chose the name Columbus in a bar. All right. But Columbus was different. All right. And so if you look at this chart here, this is city growth, which I need to update to 2020 now that we're past there. But we can see that all the other cities, major cities in Columbus, started to decline between the 50s and the 70s. Except for Columbus, it keeps growing. All right, and that is in part because of infrastructure. Columbus had control, as I said, over water and sewer. All right, and they leveraged that control because they looked around. All right, it's about actually infrastructure and annexation. They looked around, they said, man, look at Cleveland. Cleveland can't grow. Cleveland is landlocked. They've got water on one side, they got all these suburbs surrounding them, but we want to grow. We cannot become Cleveland, is what Columbus said. And so what they did is they put growth boundaries into their water and sewer contracts. And they said, all right, Worthington, you can only come so far south. Arlington, you can only come so far east. Bexley, you can't go very far at all, right? They just told them that you can't go much, you can only grow so much if you want water and sewer service, right? And they also aggressively annexed. Hanford Village isn't an independent suburb anymore on this map. They annexed Hanford Village. They annexed a lot of places that were independent suburbs or villages at one point through this aggressive annexation policy. All right. And so the other thing I want to point out is that in Columbus, and so what they did also is in 1955, early 1950s, they started doing that. And then when Brown hit in 1954, the year after that, in 55, the state of Ohio did something very curious. They passed a law that decoupled school district transfers from municipal annexation. All right. And so prior to this law, every time the city of Columbus annexed, whatever they annexed would go to Columbus City Schools. After this law, whenever the city of Columbus annexed, whatever they annexed could choose to annex into any adjacent school district. All right. Essentially, it enabled the city of Columbus to capture white flight at the expense of its urban school district. Now, at the same time, all right, and this I think started in the 70s, maybe like late 60s, an investigation was started by the NAACP and the Urban League. All right, they began to investigate the Columbus City School District because they believed that the Columbus City School District was operating a separate enclave of Black schools on the Near East Side in violation of the Brown ruling. All right, so this is going on. All right, and then as we get into the 70s, people in the Columbus City School District realize that this annexation policy is hurting their district. All right. We got white flight happening in the district. We've got a lot of suburban development happening in suburban Columbus, actually going to these suburban schools, and the city of Columbus isn't getting any of those property taxes. In fact, this policy was essentially a developmental red line in the Columbus City School District. There wasn't residential property being built. And so much of the district had been graded poorly by the Hulk and all these others. There was a lot of disinvestment in the central city, right? And so some parents in Clintonville started a movement. And their movement was to take back the common areas. And so common areas were those places that were Columbus schools and that were city of Columbus, but suburban schools. All right. And so that movement is taking off. All right. And they're fighting to recouple school district transfers with municipal annexations and put things back to where they believe they should be. All right. But then in 1979, Columbus has its own school desegregation case called Pennock, and you know the district was in fact found and guilty of operating an enclave of African American schools on the Near East Side. It was the remedy was busing. It was implemented on September 6, 1979, and it was phased out in 1995. Excuse me. And so this all. But the Take Back the Common Area movement was still really heating up. And people were starting to get nervous about buying property in those common areas. They didn't know if they bought a Dublin common area or a Worthington or a Westerville common area, would their kids still be going to those schools in a year or two? So something had to be done. So the city brought in a negotiator, and they hammered out a deal that they called win-win. All right. And so this deal essentially did three things. It recoupled school district transfers with municipal annexations moving forward. All right. It made all existing boundaries permanent. And it created a tax share arrangement where the suburban districts would pay a portion of the taxes from new residential development to the Columbus City School District. This was all on a 6-year renewal. Every 6 years, it had to be renewed. All right. Last time it was up for renewal, it was not renewed. Boundaries are still permanent, but there is no payment happening between the school districts. And this is what we look like today. City of Columbus, about 40% of the city of Columbus is serviced by suburban school districts. More than half of the Worthington School District is a common area. For example, a large portion of Westerville on the southern end, a lot of Hilliard. I think Hilliard might actually have the largest, and Southwestern also has large common areas. Oh yeah, sorry, I got ahead of myself. These are the groups involved in Win-Win. And this is a great book where you can read about it. And also Kevin Cox just put out a new book called Boomtown Columbus, which also speaks about the annexation policy as well. And it's a very good book. And so here's where we are in Central Ohio. Schools are really important, and who zones. Land use policy is really important. These common areas, I want to show this. These common areas with over half of Worthington School District, for example, in the common area, drives diversity. Worthington schools would be about 90% white if it wasn't for their common areas. I think they're like 76 or 80% white instead. And this is true for many of our suburban school districts, and that's because of land use policy in those areas. The city of Columbus has different land use policy that is not as exclusionary in the common areas. as those independent suburbs. And so it does drive diversity in our schools. And, a lot of parents in common that live in those suburban school districts like that their districts are diverse, which I find interesting. So now we want to get into some current examples. We're going to talk to you a little bit about the racial disparities. And so Michael's going to take over now. Do you want to switch the sharing, Michael, or do you want me to just do it for you?
Yeah, we can switch to sharing.
All right, we'll be just a moment, folks.
So thank you, Glennon. Thank you, Glennon, for discussing kind of the historical processes that influence today's housing market, and a variety of other different policies that, while technically now illegal, other more insidious processes were in place to perpetuate inequality in our housing market. So today I'm going to go over a couple of examples. I'm going to be talking about current today processes that are in place that lead to racially disparate outcomes for depending on how they're implemented. And so one of the projects that I want to share with you all is the outcome of our Franklin County auditor work. This is Columbus's housing market, and this is the graphic of the average price, sale price per square foot of a home. So if I have a 1,000 square foot home, and I basically just add the zeros on 3 zeros to the end of this, and that would be the sale price. So one of the things you notice between white and this is Franklin County specifically, when we look at white majority neighborhoods, in 2010, coming into the kind of in the middle part of the recession, getting ready to come out of it, the average sale price for a home, if it was 1,000 square feet, would be $101,000. And you kind of see this dip as we're going through the impact of foreclosures and other things in certain neighborhoods, and then this upward trajectory that just continues to go. And it's continuing. Housing prices in Franklin County and a lot of other places across the country actually prices are just consistently rising. A lot of that's due to low interest rates and low building. So a lot of places, our single family zoning, which the majority of our cities in our country are, that really tempers demand or supply. And so you have increased demand for those homes and other things like that, and that drives up the price. And so one of the things we notice here in Franklin County in particular is that we have a dual housing market between majority white neighborhoods, majority black neighborhoods, and then more diverse neighborhoods kind of in the middle in terms of sale prices. So if I have a 1,000 square foot home, and the average sale price in 2011 in a black majority neighborhood would be $37,000 versus $96,000 for a white home or a home that sells in a white majority neighborhood. And so one of the things we notice is that this gap is persistent and hasn't gone away. It hasn't decreased. So you're looking at, if you have a 1,000 square foot home, the average price difference between a white majority neighborhood and a black majority neighborhood in Franklin County would be about $55,000. In 2019, the data which we have for most available would be $63,000. So it's gone up. So one of the other things we note is that in Franklin County, one of the things we're seeing in the housing market is that we're getting a lot of development pressure and market pressure into lower income neighborhoods. And that's driving up the prices a lot in lower income neighborhoods and majority and minority neighborhoods in particular. And so one of the things that we look at with the Franklin County auditor, and this is real estate appraisal for property tax assessment purposes. This isn't the independent real estates at point of sale that come in and determine the valuation of your home. We didn't look at that study because we don't have access to that data. So we're looking at this in terms of every 3 years, Franklin County property values are reassessed for property tax assessment purposes. And so one of the things that we look at and that the industry standard of looking at in terms of price differentials is the sale ratio. So this is looking at the price of the home divided by what it's assessed at. And ideally, you'd want it to be at 1. You want it to be as close or within 10% of the sale value. So that way you're getting price assessed equitably. And one of the things that we noticed when we looked at homes that sold in Franklin County in the past was that when you break it out by race, the racial composition of the neighborhoods, one of the things that we noticed was that there was substantial overvaluation in more diverse and black majority neighborhoods in particular compared to majority white neighborhoods. And those effects were amplified by the level of racial segregation in the neighborhoods. So notice that neighborhoods that are 90% or more white have never actually, in Franklin County on average, have been appraised at their sale price. They've always been below. It never even, it doesn't get to 1 on this graphic. But when you look at, you know, a black majority neighborhood that's like 50 to 70% white, you have this really strong higher amount. And then as you notice, as time goes on, the lines converge. Now you may be asking, like, what's going on with the neighborhoods that are black 70 to 90% black? Like, why is this so variable? The reasoning for that is because there are fewer neighborhoods in Franklin County, and that kind of affects the stability of that. So there are less of a sample in this line here, and that's why it's more chaotic. But the rest of the lines, there's a larger sample, and so that's why they look more stable. But one of the things you notice is that once you get to 2016, there's a change in the model. And the Franklin County Auditor's Office actually switched their vendor in terms of how the model was created. And now you actually notice that the disparities have been remediated pretty substantially. Within 10% points disparity is pretty normal given the neighborhoods, but this is kind of the way it works. But one of the other things you notice is that property tax valuations have consistently trended downward. That's no accident. That's more politically because you don't want to overtax property owners. So that's why this line has consistently gone down. And that's that in lots of other places around the state. It's a state legislative thing that's approved to allow for this decreasing trend. So you won't be able to find very many homes now around that are appraised for what they sell for. Typically the assessed valuation is substantially lower. So when we look at the number of years in this time period in terms of overvaluation, do you remember Glennon's point about the T? You see it again right here. That T shows up again. So this is the number of years that the property valuations on average for that neighborhood were overvalued. And one of the things that you notice is that there's been consistent overvaluation in certain neighborhoods. So we're looking at Linden, South Linden in particular, where my pointer is, North Linden even, we're starting to get there too, Southfield, which is on the south side, Stombaugh Elwood, which is in this vicinity, also on the south side, Eastmore, that's over here on the east side. These are all Columbus neighborhoods. You have Vassar Village, which is south side, Innis Garden, south side, Southern Orchards, near east, south side, and then Central Hilltop neighborhoods as well. So the darker reds are the number of years on average that the majority of the homes in that neighborhood that sell are overvalued, are overassessed for property taxes. So these folks and the residents that live in these neighborhoods are actually paying a disproportionately high amount of property tax compared to other neighborhoods. And when we look at neighborhoods that are undervalued or that are consistently being appraised at what they're less than what they sell for, you notice places like Victorian Village, Old Town East, Marion Village, on the kind of more central to the core. And then you have suburban municipalities like Grandview Heights, Marble Cliff, and up for the older parts of Upper Arlington, which consistently have undervaluation. And so to be equitable in terms of property tax assessments, you should not have these types of geographic trends and patterns. So the other component that we looked at was quality grading. So all of these components is just a graphic that goes into property grades or quality grades of property. And typically higher grade properties are nicer. They have higher built materials. They're more ornate. They cost more to reconstruct, basically. So all of these indicators, all of these components that an appraiser gathers is used to go into the replacement cost. Now, Franklin County Auditor does not go into the inside of properties during their mass appraisals. So things like room quality and the level of finishes on the interiors are not as much of a factor. But the rest of things, as it relates to the exterior of the home, are important. And all of these things go in to derive a replacement cost. And so one of the things we looked at in terms of replacement costs were where are higher grade properties? Because if you have higher grade properties, then they should be assessed higher. And then lower grade properties should actually have a lower appraisal because they would cost less to replace. And so the places in the warmer colors on this map actually have lower grade and should have a lower replacement cost. And then you have the ones in kind of the greens and the greenish blues here in higher grades. And so one of the things that we notice is that you have high grade properties. They're often existent in new construction in certain places, not everywhere. which is interesting. And then you also have traditionally, historically expensive locales. So these are the places that have some of those exclusionary zoning requirements that Glennon had mentioned. So like you need to have copper gutters on the home. You need to have brick or stucco exteriors. Your home needs to be 5,000 square feet or more, you know, and all of those types of components, right? So they're really class-based in a lot of cases in action and in practice today, but also have racially disparate outcomes depending on the locations that you look at across Franklin County. But one of the things we also notice is that lowest grade clusters seem to be located in historically Black settlements like American Addition, Urban Crest, the Crossroads neighborhood, Stonewall Elwood, which is down here on the south side, also by I forget the name of the steel company that was over there. And so this ties into even today that lack of investment in infrastructure, the historical impacts of that, and the historical rents, and even to today, the disinvestment policies that have occurred throughout history to today have led to these property grade disparities between certain neighborhoods. So when we look at it by race, in terms of the neighborhoods, when we look at Black majority neighborhoods, diverse neighborhoods, and white neighborhoods that are majority, you notice this pattern of property grades where you have higher grade properties in white majority neighborhoods, and then it's followed by diverse neighborhoods. And C is average, so that's your standard, you know, your base level. And the majority of properties in Franklin County are actually graded C, or kind of plus or minus C. And that's kind of where we saw this weird disparity, where there was some subjectivity in terms of the pluses and minuses applied to property grades. The other thing to note is that white majority neighborhoods are 6 times more likely to have a C plus or better property grade compared to Black majority neighborhoods. And so one of the things you may be asking yourself is, okay, well, if the gradings are higher, then shouldn't the assessed valuations be higher? That didn't really pan out. Because when you look at it in the sale price in the aggregate, for some reason, which we're still trying to figure out, you still have that appraisal disparity where better, higher quality, more expensive homes are still being assessed at a lower value than what they would sell for. So something's amiss here with that. So then when we look at it in terms of the dollar amounts, in terms of average valuations across the county, property values are going up. So one of the things to note, particularly when we look at Black majority neighborhoods, is that they've corrected. They should be going up if, you know, based on sale prices. But the reality is, prior to 2015, they overassessed those neighborhoods so much that as they've corrected, those property valuations have actually come down to be more in line. So that's why we see less of a disparity today. But that entire period during the Great Recession, and up to 2015, where those properties were being frequently overassessed, there's some substantial disparity throughout that. The auditor has worked really hard to fix those issues and other things today, so I want to give them credit for that. But we still have that historical thing, which is not so far away. It was not so far in the past. And this type of disparity that we see is actually frequently playing out in lots of other places across the country. And so Columbus is not, it's an outlier in that. They're actually an outlier in terms of actually taking steps today to fix it. But you know, those things still exist. Some other things to note. So that was the Franklin County Auditor, just some highlights. Our report is on our website if you're interested in looking at the recommendations to the auditor and other things in there, which we can post the link to for those interested. But some other examples that are current. I've actually been frequently interested in looking at the questions around the commodification of housing and housing as an investment. Because there's a whole group of investors out there, institutional investors, bloggers, other real estate professionals that grade neighborhoods in terms of investor risk. And they often are co-located with race and the racial majority and class of neighborhoods. And so there's this organization out there that has developed a star neighborhood rating system. And it's a nationwide system, and they focus on metropolitan areas. So if you're looking in a rural county, they're not gonna be a part of this. But for metropolitan areas across the country, they have actually platforms out there for individual cities and profiles. This is a map that I created from it to highlight kind of this disparity. And so one of the things we notice is this data-driven approach. It's used to reduce the risk to investors. So if you're a landlord, right, and you're looking to expand your real estate portfolio, where should I buy? Where should I not buy? What's the risk I'm taking if I do buy for real estate in a certain area? It could also be applied to flippers and other types of folks who are interested in the real estate speculation kind of game. And so it uses data from the U.S. Census. They combine things such as income, poverty. I don't think they explicitly use race, but their methodology is hidden, so I don't know. But in terms of impact, this is Franklin County. And one of the things you notice is the larger circles where you have, which are majority and minority, the biggest circles, they are co-located with the areas with the lowest stars. And so 1-star neighborhoods are the highest risk, 5-star neighborhoods are the lowest risks. Interestingly to me, it looks very familiar to a redlining map, only much larger in scale because Columbus has grown so much. And so these tools, I fear that these tools can be used to perpetuate those types of things. Their legacy of redlining, neighborhoods, where to target investment, where to issue mortgages, where to not issue mortgages, where to buy rental property, where to not, right? All of these big data decisions are driving this. And they're co-located and actually have racial implications. Because like, if you look at Westgate, remember Glennon had mentioned it was a hub of wealth on the west side of Columbus. It's a 4-star neighborhood, but everything else around it isn't. Bexley shows up here pretty strong. Upper Arlington, those Clintonville, Worthington, those neighborhoods that showed up on that redlining map, with the exception actually of kind of the more central neighborhoods, such as the Short North Victorian Village, and German Village, which can be attributed to the historical designation of those neighborhoods, which and other types of gentrificational investment pressures that have been made and exist. And so that's one example. This is the implication in terms of it's summarized into a graphic. So if you look at the racial composition of the neighborhoods that are 1-star, you can see that they're majority Black, and that they're by far the most diverse. You look at 2-star neighborhoods, 3-star neighborhoods, 4-star neighborhoods, 5-star neighborhoods, 4 and 5-star neighborhoods. 3, 4, and 5 are majority white neighborhoods. And then there are some that don't have data for a variety of reasons. Typically, it's because they don't have the mortgage, the average payment for the home, or the median home value, or the median rental value. Typically, that's the reason why, in terms of one of the indicators they include as to why it's no data. Some other examples. There's a blog out there called Bigger Pockets. Don't go into the chats and the things they talk about. And then because it's actually very coded, they use very coded language in terms of directing, where to invest and where to not. This is Cleveland, my hometown. The red neighborhoods here are by far the most dangerous. They're often referred to in terms of, because they break it down by zip code in this analysis, and they talk about, they frequently mention kind of classist things such as Section 8 tenants. It's violent. It's not a good neighborhood. A lot of coded language in there. But this is just another example. And then another example I wanted to share with you all that's relatively recent, actually within the last year, is Redfin. So there are some benefits to listing your home on Redfin. So they have lower brokerage fees, sales commissions. They do 3D services like 3D walkthroughs, virtual tours. They prioritize your property listings on their website, so you're more likely to get buyers and other things. But they have this troubling thing that they've included known as minimum price threshold. So if you're below the minimum price threshold in a particular metropolitan area, you're ineligible for any of those services. So you don't get the 3D service, walkthrough of your home. You don't get priority listing. You don't get the extra sales commission bonus, the $1,500 referral and closing costs for using their service. You don't get any of those things at point of sale. And so there's a lawsuit out there now filed by the National Fair Housing Organization or National Fair Housing Association that had filed a discriminatory lawsuit out. I'm not sure of the outcome of it yet, but when you look at places like Detroit, Chicago, Baltimore, they found that majority and minority neighborhoods were more than 4 times likely in Detroit, more than 7 times likely to not have services in Chicago, more than almost 6 times as likely in Baltimore. This is a map of Baltimore where the red dots are ineligible and the green dots are eligible, overlaid by race. And you could kind of see, this is today, these types of real estate practices where you have big data and information out there driving these decisions that lead to racially disparate outcomes and impacts. And so those are some other examples. I'll go ahead and stop sharing and we could jump into Q&A.
Thanks, Michael.
Mhm.
It's like we don't have any questions that are live right now.
Yes, actually, thank you. The questions, just for your FYI, for both of you, are in the answered sections. Those are the ones that we have, and I'll go ahead and queue those up. Before I started, wanted to just thank you both for a wonderful presentation. We had a lot of questions, actually, in the answer sections, as well as people sharing some experiences. Some people shared experiences about American Addition. Some people shared resources about the Ridgewood neighborhood that are in there. Highly suggested everybody check those out. And I'm going to go ahead and start off with some questions for the both of you. But if either of you are scrolling through this list and see something that you want to answer at some point, feel free to do that as well. So I'll start out with the question that we got first. It says, around the city, there are many neighborhoods that have huge front lawns, just grass. Are these likely the result of minimum area rules as restrictive requirements?
They are probably more likely zoning than restrictive covenants at this point. They're probably a result of minimum lot requirements in the zoning code. And so, requiring a quarter acre or whatever the size of the lawn, which, if your house isn't taking up that whole space, you're going to have a lot of grass.
Good answer. Yeah, and also a reminder for everybody, you can still post questions in the Q&A, and we'll get to those on a first come, first served basis. I don't know if you had anything to add to that, Michael, or anything.
Oh no, that was pretty to the point.
Great. Someone said they actually lived in Beaver Creek when you were talking about it, and they would be interested to read more about the zoning laws that you mentioned, and asked if you had any recommendations.
So our work around Beaver Creek was related to the documentary that we produced a few years back called Free to Ride. And so everything I learned about Beaver Creek was really through that. And I just used it as an example because I know about their zoning, but you can go, pretty much any city will have their zoning code available online. Not any city, but most cities in major metropolitan areas, I should say, will have their zoning code available online. So I'm pretty sure if you just go to the Beaver Creek City website, to their zoning and development department, you should be able to find it and see what their requirements are.
And then some specific recommendations around the zoning laws is to keep in mind and look at the kind of development projects that are coming forth and the political pushback you may get from certain residents in the community. So I typically like to pay attention to development proposals that include like multifamily housing or rental housing specifically. Because those typically receive the most feedback or most pushback from either neighbors or residents in the community because they just don't want them. They want, a lot of folks want single family homes, again, kind of because they fear residents and other types of potential residents, or they'll throw it under traffic concerns or congestion and not make it about people. But they do those traffic studies and they can rule out those types of impacts oftentimes. So just be mindful of those.
They will also say character of the community. Like this isn't aligned with the character of our community for denser projects too.
Mm-hmm.
Those are really great questions. The next question was specifically for Glennon. It was talking about, does this practice of redlining still exist in different and more covert forms? For example, those same down payment requirements and loan to value based on credit rating kind of situations, and wanted to see if you had any thoughts about that.
And I think Michael can answer this too. I know Michael's actually found, so like, from my understanding, redlining is illegal. Okay, it's illegal to do this, but You know, I have heard that banks still do this covertly because they want to make sure they're giving loans in places where they're not going to be at risk. And Michael, I believe, has even found developers, I think, probably practice this the most in terms of where they want to develop. And Michael has found online, I mean, that some of the rating systems he showed are very similar to redlining maps. He's found, you know, things developers have done. Do you want to speak to that a little, Michael?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, oftentimes, you know, developers will frequently cite costs in a neighborhood, or they'll go through a neighborhood in terms of rebranding it. So if it has, you know, a negative connotation or negative name to it, you know, then you'll get this new branding campaign or something else to try and improve the image of the neighborhood. And you know, oftentimes, you know, it's really interesting because in certain neighborhoods, particularly in Columbus, that just aren't active in development, you'll often hear from developers saying, "Well, I'm not ready to invest in that neighborhood." You know, someone has to, take the bullet first for me to be interested to want to even bother. You know, and so it's hard to tease out explicitly because it's illegal. But in practice, in terms of where the dollars go, in terms of where the investment goes, you often see, you know, risk. It's about folks in those communities or the economic activity in the neighborhood or other things like that that are very, very correlated with it. So yeah, it's very covert.
And I want to remind people that the current conditions in a lot of these communities, those conditions can be traced back to these historic policies. You know, Worthington and Upper Arlington are doing well because they receive investment. They benefited from investment, policies of investment. They benefited from highways. They benefited from being graded A and B by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, right? They were receiving federally insured mortgages. They benefited from the way we got around, well, especially Worthington in particular, probably one of the communities that benefited the most from the way that we got around Brown, right? And then, you know, other communities have really been hit time and time again by these policies. They were destroyed by highways. They were disinvested in by redlining, right? They were communities that didn't employ racial restrictions and people were stuck there, you know? So keep in mind that history matters.
Fantastic. Yeah, and we have a whole lot of questions, and before I go on, I will ask, and you're free to say no. Do you have time to stay on for 5 or so more minutes to answer?
Yeah.
Yep.
We'll try to get to a few more. My apologies if we don't get to your question. This has just been a topic that's just generated a lot of conversation. So go both of you of giving us a lot to think about. The next question is about harassment, and it's talking about, says, speaking of harassment, any info about using areas as containment zones, quote unquote, where certain vices like gambling and prostitution would not be enforced by the LE. I think that's the,
law enforcement, I think.
Law enforcement, yeah. So I think we're talking more about zoning as a containment device for vices and, law enforcement, and maybe how that impacts some of this as well. I don't know if either of you have any thoughts on that.
I mean, I would say, do you see any of those unfavorable uses in suburban neighborhoods?
Mm-hmm.
So typically, go ahead.
I was just going to say those are part of expulsive zoning. Like that, like to zone those, that's expulsive zoning. That's an example of it. Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, so typically you see those types of things around the zoning of sexually oriented businesses, and how they're often cited and put in places where there are distressed commercial corridors or industrial places, which are away from residents, away from the schools and other things like that. So, and where, historically speaking, where have we seen those and where have they gone? Because of the expulsive zoning Glennon had mentioned, yes.
Well, and in neighborhoods where where you've seen so much disinvestment, people don't have as much agency, they don't have as much ability to fight back, and they don't have as much voice in city government because they are low income and disenfranchised.
Yep.
Really good point. It's really good.
And in terms of law enforcement, I just want to point out that, like, one thing about, like, particularly white, more exclusive suburbs, the role of law enforcement in those suburbs is to protect white people and white property, And so in many ways, in my opinion, I think that suburban law enforcement can be much more dangerous for people of color. But that's just an opinion right there.
It's a really good thing to think about. Exactly. So another question that was kind of next is talking about, have you found national standards for performing this type of analysis? You know, I think internally we've talked about that quite a bit in how opportunity has been used in different ways, in unexpected ways for us. And so I didn't know if I'd leave that there, if you either of you had any thoughts about this analysis and how it's been nationally and standards for that kind of work.
So you mean the auditor's work? I assume that's what this is referring to.
Yeah.
I will let Michael answer this.
Yeah, so I would say in terms of national standards, that was one of the hard things that we found. We didn't really, in terms of the landscape analysis, we found a couple of academics articles out there in terms of pointing to the real estate disparity and that it exists in terms of the appraisal market. But we didn't find many national standards for recommendations on how to fix it. That was what we had to look at, after having multiple conversations with the auditor and other appraisal teams and other things of the nature, trying to pick apart the models they use, the data they put into the model, how to mitigate implicit bias in the work. So in terms of national standards, I haven't found any. I frequently cite like the IAAO, which is the International Association of Auditing Officers, I think is what the acronym is. In terms of their best practices, in terms of how to ensure that values are at least numerically, from a statistical standpoint, equal and correct. But oftentimes those recommendations are used and applied in such a way that the geography of where those numbers are applied are too broad, or they're insufficient to get at the level of detail we did with this analysis. So yeah, in terms of national standards, no. In terms of recommendations and best practices, no. But the work is evolving and it is becoming more researched, and I'm sure there will be more recommendations and other things that come out of it.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you. Our next question is about eminent domain, and it's asking if you can explain how eminent domain impacted the disparate outcomes in terms of segregation and the government's responsibility in affecting disparity. And so I guess this could be historically or contemporarily.
So eminent domain is when the government wants to use land for a public purpose and then purchases it at a fair market value and then develops it for a public purpose. We have seen that eminent domain has been used for private development as well, and that the courts have allowed that. So eminent domain has been used as a tool of gentrification. It has been used, it was used to construct highways, right? And if the federal government's going to be buying land, we're going to buy land that's the cheapest, right? And since we did this redlining policy in the 1930s, we know which land is the cheapest, would be one way to look at that as well. So eminent domain is interesting. The way that the courts have allowed it to be used for private development is, I think, a bit concerning in terms of equity, particularly with how it's been used as a tool for gentrification. Do you have anything to add, Michael?
No, I think that was the point.
Yeah, that's great. Well, as a last question, because I know we're past time, and thank you for sharing your extra time with this. Someone asked if Glennon could talk about the small community that was adversely affected by highway development. Yes.
Hanford Village. I cut that slide because we were trying to cut slides. I apologize. I couldn't remember if I cut it, and I got boosted on Monday, and I was so sick the last 2 days. So I apologize, folks. So Hanford Village was a really cool independent suburb that was founded, I think, early, I forget the exact year, early in the 1900s. By 1925, it was predominantly African-American. They elected their first Black mayor. It was really considered kind of a model African-American community. There were a lot of Black suburbs at the time where the residents were really trying to show white people, look, we're just like you. We have great communities. We care about our schools, and we live upstanding lives. And Hanford Village was really one of those communities where they had a great community center, great fire station, good school. They had good land use. I mean, if you think about how we collect taxes in the state of Ohio, it's income taxes that really matter. And they were not overwhelmingly residential, which has been a problem for places like Upper Arlington, right, where they had a fiscal crisis back in the mid 2010s because of their land use and their inability to collect revenue, right? But Hanford Village had industrial land use, they had commercial land use, and they had a really nice residential area. And so one thing we know also is that, you know, when the GI Bill came out in the post-war period, one of the benefits was housing assistance. But due to racial restrictions and just, you know, straight up racism in the housing market, most Black GIs were unable to use their GI benefits. So a lot of Black communities would build privately funded GI housing. And eventually the FHA did open up a line of credit specifically for Black GIs, but it was not nearly enough to meet the demand for the number of Black GIs that we had. So Hanford Village built one of these communities. They built, it was called the Washington Carver Edition. And they built this, I think in, when was it, Michael, 46 or so?
Yeah.
In 1946. And then roughly 10, 12 years later, 70, you know, because Bexley lobbied to have 70 not go through them, 70 barreled right through Hanford Village. And I mean, it just destroyed the community. It cut the industrial and commercial areas off from the residential area, destroyed most of the residential community. Almost all of it is gone. What remains is the Washington Carver Edition. I think in 2014, that was finally put on the National Register of Historic Places. Because some of the original families still own the homes in that portion of Hanford Village that's now part of Columbus. But when that highway went through, it pretty much destroyed the community. And they also had a really nice community park. And you can still see that park actually when you're getting off the highway to go to Bexley. It's in between the On and Ralph ramp. That's the Hanford Village Park. So that's what the highway did to Hanford Village. And eminent domain was used to buy that land. That's how we did all of our highways also.
That is a thoughtful piece to end off with. I don't know if you had anything to add, Michael.
No, it's perfect.
Do you know anything about the history of Berwick, Michael?
Oh yeah, regarding Berwick, yeah, it was a racially exclusive community. It was founded with racially restrictive covenants, and they actually were incredibly opposed to the Hanford Village project, and they actually fought it. They actually ended up delaying the project for 2 years because they fought it so hard, and Hanford Village almost didn't happen because of it, just because of the proximity of it. And then the highways came in, and they also lobbied against to not have it go through their neighborhood, which is why it goes down along Allen Creek.
Wow. So yeah, we could probably do a whole thing on just, you know, Columbus's lost Black neighborhoods.
That actually could be an interesting.
I think, you know, there was a lot of
think about that for next forum season, Chip.
You know, maybe we may have come up with another forum ideal right here at the end.
And folks, if you have additional questions, I'm happy. I'll give you my email. Michael, give you his. Mine's Sweeney, SWEENEY.270 at osu.edu.
And also, put those, when we send out the recording, also give your email addresses if you're okay with that for questions.
Outreach is .1 also is Michael's. He's .1.
Yep, thanks. Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, and we could definitely make those available. I've copied a few of the questions in the chat. Also, some people gave some wonderful some data and some resources in the chat. If you haven't gotten a chance to check those out, please check those out while I do my closing. I think they're fantastic. But I just wanted to thank both you, Glennon and Michael, for everything that you shared in the conversation you were able to generate with us today. A lot of great questions, a lot of great conversation, and maybe spaces to go for later. So thank you for that. Thank you to our participants and people who asked such lovely questions. And I just want to wish everybody a good rest of the day. As we talked about before, we should have this recording coming out with our advertisement for the next forum. And those usually come out Monday or Tuesday. So be on the watch for those. We also make them available through our social media. So be on the lookout for that as well. And I don't know if either of you have any last words to say.
Thank you very much, folks.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, everybody. Have a good rest of the day. Thank you so much.
Thanks, you too.
Bye-bye.